Thanks for being with us, friends. We are continuing in the Abraham story, actually getting closer to the end of the Abraham story as both he and Sarah are aging. Isaac is now on the scene, and this story will shift largely to Isaac in the next chapter. But today we have an entire chapter, I would say devoted to the death of Sarah, Michael, but really most of the chapter has to do with Abraham and the funeral arrangements. And rather than read this is long, but I'll read a couple verses and then we can tell you the story of the rest of what happened. So we're in chapter 23 here. Sarah lived 127 years. This was the length of Sarah's life, and Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Abraham rose up from beside the dead and said to the Hittites, I am a stranger, an alien residing among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, so that I might bury my dead out of my sight. So a couple of interesting things here before we get into kind of the rest of the story. The most interesting thing that has been made of this story is that it seems to indicate for some portion of Abraham and Sarah's life, they may have been residing in different places. Sarah is in this place, Hebron, and as we last left the story of Abraham, remember that he lived in Beersheba. And there are those who have read into that the possibility that this episode with Isaac, where Abraham took Isaac and was willing to sacrifice him, may have put a wedge between them. It may have been that Sarah simply couldn't be where Abraham was anymore. Now, we don't know that. That is very much conjecture, and so take that for what it's worth, which is very little. But there are people who have wondered why the Bible would tell us where Abraham is, and then in the very next passage tell us that Sarah is somewhere else. And you'll notice here that it says that Abraham rose, he went to mourn for Sarah in the land of Canaan. And so this is just a very interesting detail in the story. It's not clear what we should make out of it, but there are those who have thought that perhaps the Scripture's trying to tell us something.
So we've traced this theme numerous times now, the importance of your offspring in the Old Testament. Of course, that is central here to God's promise to Abraham. A theme that maybe we've teased out less often, but I would say is no less present in the Old Testament, is that of geography. That idea of where God is taking you. Certainly that becomes a prominent theme in the book of Exodus, with the idea of being taken to the promised land and the wandering in the wilderness and all of the geographic sort of context that story has. Here, it is striking and notable that at the end of Sarah's life, they continue to live in a foreign land. This idea that they continue to be on the road towards God carrying them forward. So while God has kept this promise of the covenant bearer, God continues to be leading and guiding. So the story of Abram and also Sarai that began with them being called out of a foreign place and forward is in many ways still a thing that's happening, so that even at the end of his wife's life, now we find in chapter 23 here, Abraham now still has to negotiate for a place to bury his wife because he's not on land that is his. And, that's a meaningful nod from the text that God's plan is still in motion, that it extends beyond the lifespan of just those first two people. And we're going to see that more explicitly as we move forward. But that theme of geography, how it anchors the story, that remains important. And I think we see it here in this story.
Yeah, and we see it throughout the story because this burial site becomes the burial place for Abraham and for some of the lineage after them. This is seen in many ways, if there was such a thing, as their family burial plot. And Israel, the nation of Israel, will look to this location as the cemetery of sorts for this covenant family, the kind of patriarchal family. The rest of the story is interesting. Abraham meets with the Hittites, who are willing to give him the land. They say, just take it. And he essentially says, no, I want to make sure that I'm 100% above board, name a price, and they come to an agreement, and he pays. And the idea, I think, here is the integrity of Abraham, that he's not willing to accept something that he didn't earn. He doesn't want this as a gift. There's that kind of a little bit of a stubbornness of saying, I am going to buy this. I'm not going to take a gift for my wife's burial place. It is the right thing to do to purchase that, and it should cost me, and I'm going to pay it. And we see some other stories like that scattered in the Old Testament, but this seems to be what's going on here.
Yeah, there's no theft. There's no trickery. There's no getting the better of this. This is a straight up honorable transaction in which the land is purchased outright, and therefore it rightly belongs to the one who bought it. That, when we read the Bible devotionally, it's things like this that sometimes slip by us, because fundamentally, there's not much of an immediate takeaway here in terms of what you're going to do today, other than, fundamentally, God calls us to be people who are honest and people who live rightly in the land where we are, whatever land that is, or whether we be from there or not, right? And so Abraham here seeks to do right, even in the presence of the generosity of others. He insists, no, let me pay the fair price for it. And so here we end with him getting to bury his wife in a place where she and the family following her will have a final place to be both remembered, but then also, of course, returned to. A sort of continuation of their stories in the place.
Right, and if you've had family members, I suspect nearly all of us, probably all of us have, that have been buried. I mean, there is something tangible, there's something physical and spiritual about a person's grave site. I was recently in Sioux City and went to a cemetery to find my grandmother's grave, which I struggled to do because, as it turned out, they had removed a sidewalk a few years ago, and I knew where it should be, but I also knew it was near the sidewalk, and so one of those things was still true. But there is something tangible about where a person's body and remains are buried, and that's only more true perhaps in this story, because that represents the founder of the nation. I mean, Abraham and Sarah are the seed from which Israel grows, and the idea of knowing where their bodies are and revering that site is really important. And we will see this site come up again later in the story.
Clint, it's interesting, this language here that gets used in verse 4. Abraham says to the Hittites, I'm a stranger and an alien residing among you. This, too, is a theme that we've seen brought up again. It's amazing how the Old Testament writers do this in a way that is so natural. This idea of being an alien, being a person who's not from that spot. Remember how we talked about hospitality being such a substantial part of that culture, the idea of the rank sinfulness of Sodom, that they would not only not be hospitable, but they would go so far to the extent of being so depraved. Here we see this idea that even the Hittites are extending a form of hospitality to the alien, even a recognition that other people, though they not be the chosen people in the arc of this story, they yet have the mark of those who are willing to honor those who have gone on, recognizing the basic humanity of those who are seeking to honor their dead, the reality that not everyone that surrounded Abraham was depraved or wholly broken, as we've seen in other stories. I think sometimes we see in the scriptures these nods to the idea that, even though you might not be within the immediate umbrella of this story, there are positives shown of many different people at many different turns. And certainly this is a positive image of the Hittites. They were explicitly willing to give up this land for no cost. And so, that looks very positive in terms of these other people, though they be different, though they have different traditions and ostensibly different gods, there's still good to be found in it. And, not every religious text includes that kind of nuance, Clint. Not every text points to the positives like that. So I think we can affirm that as being a good look for others.
Right. There's actually a line in the story where Abraham says, "I'll pay you," and the man the man who owns the cave says, "My Lord, listen, a piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." And the offer is clear. He's giving him that cave. That's an act of generosity. But having named that as its value, Abraham then insists on paying him that much. But that Hittite man is extending that offer to him, saying, "Look, our relationship is worth more than that. You take this place and bury your dead. You can have it." But Abraham insists on being the one who actually owns it and wants to pay for it, which again is kind of there's a certain pridefulness in that, and it shows up a couple different places in the scripture, stories like that. So not unique, but this is the first time we've encountered it.
Clint, as I reflect here towards the end of chapter 23, it strikes me there's a way in which maybe we can say that this really does create the ending of a chapter. I mean, though Abraham continues to live in chapter 24, the death of Sarah in some ways marks the reality that the torch has been handed on, that the offspring now lives. God has miraculously saved Isaac in the binding story. And so what we're going to discover as we continue on in this study is that now we are introducing Isaac, not the young boy, but rather the one who God is going to keep the promise moving forward. And so there's a kind of transition now happening in this family, that though Abraham continues to live, this becomes a moment in which we can now see the dawning light of a new day coming. And in many ways, it will be a major handover from the original one who was promised this blessing to the line that will now follow. And it will dominate the following part of this book as we see far less chapters devoted to any single character. We're going to see this progressively move even quicker. And, in that this is a moment maybe to pause and look back and say, this is among the fullest accounts of any of these patriarchal characters that we're going to have. And with Sarah's death here, we're now coming to see the end of one as we look ahead to those who will follow.
Yeah, this is the first loss that we've had in this core lineage of the story. And that will be a theme as we go through the generations. We'll see more of that. But this is the first time we've really seen one of the central characters. And sometimes it's tough because the Bible shifts great periods of time without us really knowing it. We just turn a page and we're several decades down the road. Remember that Abraham and Sarah are about 100 when Isaac is born, and she now dies at 127. So we're talking about a young man somewhere in his mid-20s at this point, most likely. And that much time has gone by without the scripture really telling us what happened during that time. So we're hitting the high points for sure. But now, to some extent, the bulk of the storyline will shift to Isaac and then on down through the other heirs.
I won't spend too much time here, Clint. I never thought of it quite in that way. I think it's a really interesting comment. The idea, here we've just seen 20 years ostensibly go by. Isn't it interesting how when we come to the scriptures, especially if we do that in a daily kind of devotional way, we're kind of looking for a word for the day, in the sense in which the scriptures often don't concern themselves with all of the days in between. They show us God's interaction at these pivotal moments, and we're left to sort of interpolate in that there was faithfulness in the period in between, though it wasn't always remarkable enough that it was included in these texts. There's an interesting turn there I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, if Isaac was in fact a teenager when the sacrifice story happened, you know.
Oh, I'm sorry, Clint. My bad.
Are we done?
It's going to be done in about 10 seconds, so finish quick.
We've been about 10 years at least since we saw them last. See you tomorrow.
All right. Well, I made it really wonky, friends. We'll see you later. See you tomorrow.